Good morning, and I'll probably answer it pretty well straight away, and then we'll talk a bit more about shepherds and shepherding and so on. As we read there that sheep need a shepherd for protection, shearing, general health. Shepherds guide sheep to better pastures, waters, and shear them, guard the flock from predators, and also watch out for health of their flock of sheep, helping prevent disease and heal injuries. So really that's, in a nutshell, why we need a shepherd, just to generally look after us and make sure we're on the right track. And we read shepherd as a word, a noun, and a person who tends and rears sheep, which is unusual. And obviously they, particularly shepherds in the Middle East, look after their sheep differently to what we do in Australia, obviously. They're quite keen, but then a sheep herder is also a noun, a worker in charge of sheep, especially on the open range. So Australian people, farmers, would be referred to as sheep herders rather than shepherds, because a shepherd is very much involved with their own little group of sheep, and quite often they only get maybe up to 100 sheep. That's why we see it historically and in scriptures and that, where they know their names and they're named, where we, on our farm, we had 6,000, so we ran out of names after a while. So we were sheep herders because we would actually, instead of them following us, we would follow them. We would push them along, whereas shepherds lead their sheep generally, not always, but generally they lead and they find their way around. And this is sort of fairly typical of an Australian scene with a dog and a couple of kids and pushing the sheep along. And it talks a little bit here, Australian shepherds. Initially, shepherds were convicts, and after transportation ceased in the 1840s, emancipists and free men were employed. Their duty was the same as in England: look after the flock during the day and pen them nightly in folds made of hurdles. Analysis of wages and flock size indicated that pastoralists achieved good productivity gains with larger flocks, but inflation of wages reduced the gain to modest levels. The gold rush and labour shortages of the 1850s played a minor role in increasing both wages and flock sizes. Living conditions in the huts were primitive and the diet monotonous, mainly meat and bread, that was it. Shepherds were exposed to a range of diseases, especially in Queensland. Flock masters employed non-whites, usually on a lower wage, and women and children. Fences only replaced shepherds where pastoralists realised that the new technology of fences, combined with other changes, would give them higher profits. The sheep were left to fend for themselves in the open paddocks, a system used today. So that's where we sort of finished up where we are today, with quite big mobs of sheep, more so these days. When I used to spend a bit of time in the north, there was big mobs of sheep. A place called Commonwealth Hill, which is west of Tarcoola, or west of Glendambo, and you turn left at Glendambo and go about probably 300 kilometres to Tarcoola, and then you head north for about another 100, and you come into a station called Commonwealth Hill, and at that stage they had 124,000 sheep. I think they're still very similar size, but a lot of the northern sheep stations, particularly where I used to shear, and so they are now cattle stations, mainly because of dingoes. It was easier to get rid of the sheep because the dingoes would play havoc a bit and reduce the numbers. They've found that these days the dingoes are not quite as bad as they were reputed to be, but it takes a little while to get organised. But that was where the system we have today of large mobs of sheep, and just put them out and away they go. Caring for sheep in Australia, this was fairly typical on a very small scale of sorting sheep out. This fellow here, you can see him there. I suspect just by that thing there, he's weighing the sheep, probably for market or something or other. But the general system, as you can see there, is the same as we had. and you'll find a lot of stations have the same thing. To sort sheep out into ages, we used to have sheep from 1 year old up to 6 years old, and at times they were all together. And then we would run them up that drafting race, and where that man is, we used to have 2 gates, and so you could divide them into 3 groups. You could go that way, or in the middle, and you could just stand there and you'd draft off 2,000 or 3,000 sheep into various groups. And that's how it sort of worked, and there was various care taken when you do those sorts of things. You could then see if sheep were in trouble. We used to also run them through a dip, as was a spray dip. Back in when I was a lad, we used to use arsenical dips. It was a yellow powder. We'd drop in water and most of it would go over us. And then we'd run the sheep through like a big tank and spray them with this arsenical dip mixed with water, and that would kill off any lice they had. It was by law we had to do that. There was various things, the shearing and drenching them and all sorts of bits and pieces, but when you look at the general flow of what happens there is generally what happens on any sort of Australian farm, if you like, and depending on how many sheep you got as to how big it goes. This fellow, there's not many sheep, but as I say, ours was a bit bigger and others were a bit bigger again, depending on the sheep. And they were also identified. The sheep you had, sometimes temporary identification is desirable. Paint, branding, marking, crayon sticks, rattles, spray markers can be used to identify sheep and lambs for periods of several weeks, several months. Marks from the marking crayons we used lasted for about several weeks, whereas paint brands tend to last for many months. Our sheep were branded after shearing. We'd had a red HE on the rump, whereas the neighbours were a blue W on the side, on the shoulder. So if sheep would be out on the road somewhere, you'd know within reason, within a few neighbours, whose they were. So that's the idea of identification. And also, as you can see here on their ears, we used to have some marks, but mainly we used to have what we call ear tags, which were a different colour every year for the age of the sheep. So when you were drafting those sheep off, the red tags go there, the yellow tags up there, and blue tags over there. That's how it was sorted out as they came up the drafting race. That was the idea of it. And so you had to concentrate, particularly when it was dusty. You could pick it up. You can see, that one there is a cow, of course. I think it was a cow. The other half was in the freezer, maybe. But that's the general process of caring for them. And once again, a fairly typical area is probably southern Australia because it's so green. Most of our paddocks were around about 40, 50 acres or about 20 hectares each one, and we could then move the sheep around. Fresh pasture, that would reduce the idea of worms and so on. And sheep like to follow one another. And you'll notice that wherever you go, there's lines across the paddock somewhere. And most times, not always, but most times sheep will follow the one in front of them. And we used to smile at times because we used to count out the sheep and we'd run past and we'd count them at 3 together. So 3 would be 1 and you get to 33 and then plus 1 would be 100 and you'd call out a tally. But I'd say tally 1 and so on as someone else would call out as they were counting, whether it was me or my brother. But as they ran past, every now and again one would jump for no apparent reason. And because he jumped, the next one would jump, and the next one would jump, and so on. It was quite amusing the way they used to do those sorts of things. They were quite interesting things. The only part is, the interesting part of the sheep and the caring for them, it reminded me years ago, and I was always quite amused of the sheep in the north, obviously quite big paddocks, so many square kilometres, 10 or 20 square kilometres or more per paddock. They would have a trough or that sort of thing for water in one of the corners somewhere where they could bring them up and then take them through the gate. And at times We used to watch the sheep. They'd come in for a drink, and they would drink and drink and drink, and you could actually see their stomach going out. After a while you think it's going to bust, but they would then wobble off out into the paddock because they'd be gone for 3, 4, 5 days. They wouldn't need another drink. They would just fill up and away they'd go. They were interesting sort of animals that couldn't do that. But when we look at the scriptures in 2 Samuel, we see, now therefore, so shall thou say unto my servant David, thus saith the Lord of hosts, I took thee from the sheepcote, from following the sheep, to be a ruler over my people and over Israel. And I was with thee whithersoever thou wentest, and cut off all of thine enemies out of thy sight, and have made thee a great name, like unto the name of great men that are in the earth. David was, King David eventually, he was out, and the Lord said to Samuel, I took thee from the sheepcote. A sheepcote is a pen or a covered enclosure for sheep. So David at times, no doubt, he would bring the sheep and put them in there because they were safe from wolves and so on. And that was the sort of thing that was used, and he would keep an eye on that. So we see in John chapter 10, verily, verily, I say unto you that he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same as a thief and a robber. But he that entereth in by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. And when he putteth forth his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice, and a stranger will they not follow, but will flee from him, for they know not the voice of a stranger. And that's quite true. The sheep do actually get used to you. Particularly if you have a pet lamb, they drive you mad. Don't ever have pet lambs. Our house was sort of really one end of the property, and the back paddock was probably, the back gate to the back paddock was about 2 kilometres down the road. I'd go down, open that gate, then come home, open the gate and let the sheep out up by the house, because whatever finished it, whatever we were doing with them, and they would go down. My dog would stand, we used to have a road that goes off to the left, about a mile down the road, and the dog would just sit there, and the sheep wouldn't even look at him, they just go straight past to the gate and go in there. And by the time the last one was leaving by the house, the first one would be going into the paddock 2 kilometres away. So they get to know what you do, where you're going, and really Jesus talked a bit about them, and we hear the voice, and they hear our voice. Particularly at lambing time, we used to go around our sheep, around the ewes twice a day, just to check that everything was okay. Over on Kangaroo Island in the middle of winter, we used to lamb usually May, June, July. It was always very, very wet, and our property was quite wet. So the sheep would get down to have their lamb and sometimes get very cold and couldn't get up. And so we'd have to go and help them and stand them up and hold them there for quite a while until their shoulders and things got going again. It would take a while to do that. We used to go quietly, wouldn't take dogs, wouldn't take, not that we had motorbikes or cars or anything, it was always on foot. And so they would get used to you. You could walk up to a ewe that was down and, dare I say, you'd talk to them, and they would recognise your voice. They weren't very happy because maybe the lamb was stuck or they couldn't get up and because they were cold and or whatever. But they recognised the voice and not panic. You could then lift them up and hold them. Once they stood there, you move quickly, because sometimes they get frightened and they run off and leave the lamb, and the lamb either dies or you take him home for a pet. And we didn't like doing that. We used to do it for a while. When the Lord talks about the sheep hear his voice, they do that. That's quite reality. So we see here, he's talking here about the sheepfold. The sheepfold is like yards. And the gate, and they could get in there, and they were protected from wolves and other animals, lions, and, in Samuel talks about David protecting his sheep from a lion and from a bear. It wasn't just something written, it was actually reality. They were there in those days, I don't know where they are now, but also wolves and so on. So they used to bring them into these sorts of areas, and they could then protect them, look after their sheep. And that's called a sheepfold. And that was another one there with bushes all around the top and the gates. And the Lord said, I am the door. And that's the idea. If they didn't have a gate, that's where the shepherd would sit, in the doorway. And that's why Jesus said, I am the door. If you want to get in to the protected area, you go through Jesus Christ. If you want to get into the kingdom of God, to the protection and to the hope of the future, you go through Jesus Christ. That's really what he's saying there. I am the door. In the book of Revelations, he talks about in the New Jerusalem, the gates are a pearl of great price. I wonder who he's talking about. Jesus Christ is the door or the pearl of great price. And when we've found it, we sell everything else, get rid of everything else in life and take hold of that and hang on to the hope we have. And we're talking here what skills shepherds need, day-to-day management, they multitask, guiding sheep because they've got to sort of look after them, warding off predators, managing pregnancies and so on. The job can be mentally and physically draining. I'm not sure that was the case in our place, but probably physically, certainly. At the end of the day, at times you'll be exhausted. Shepherds endure extreme weather conditions along with their sheep, and quite often those sheepfolds and so on were during the winter, particularly in Israel, around that area, the Middle East, their house was a building and they would be sort of in one part of it, in a very small part, like not the sheep, the shepherd and his family, and the sheep or the cattle or whoever was inside in the sheds. So it would give them protection in the winter because of the snow and so on. In the middle of winter up in the mountains around Israel, you don't have sheep, they'd be all dead because it's too cold. Autumn they would start heading down to the coastal areas around the Mediterranean, and then in the winter they'd take them back into their sheds. So that's how it was, and see at times it would come in very quickly and cold and so on and very hot. It does get very hot over there as well. So there's enduring that as well. They need to be alert, managing pregnant ewes and so on. It was always a big thing because particularly younger ewes having their first lamb, you had to keep an eye on things, and quite often they would be struggling, you'd have to help them out. Also their general welfare, because looking after their sicknesses and life-threatening situations and so on. We used to change the paddocks quite regularly because that would help with intestinal worms and all those sorts of bits and pieces. We see in Genesis in chapter 4 the story of Cain and Abel. Abel was the keeper of the sheep and Cain was the tiller of the ground. And process of time, Cain brought the fruit of the ground and offered unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought the firstling of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel. And Cain wasn't happy. And it started there, this process of sacrificing animals. Well, it started a bit before these. God sacrificed animals back in Genesis chapter 3, I think it is, to make coats for Adam and Eve. And then later on, obviously, Abel saw it and Cain saw it. The idea is to offer sacrifices to the Lord, and Abel brought forth the firstlings of his flock, the best and the first. And we see here, back in the time of the Passover, when the people of Israel were moving out of Egypt, Moses instructed the Jewish people about the details of the first Passover offering on the 10th day of this month. Let each one of you take a lamb for each parental home, a lamb for each household, and you shall keep it for inspection unto the 14th day of the month. An entire congregation of the community of Israel shall slaughter it in the afternoon. So they keep it for 4 days before they actually did anything with it. Why? They think the idea, because the ancient Egyptian worshipped lambs. So by taking a lamb, the Egyptians' deity, into their homes for 4 days with the intention of slaughtering it and eating it was an act of notice by the Egyptians. It was extremely likely that they would be infuriated by the disrespect of their God. This act of courage, standing up for their belief, followed the God's commandment in the face of possible danger. So the Egyptians had this sheep or lamb as their God. And the children of Israel took a lamb into their house with the idea of killing it off. And they were going to paint the blood on the lintels and so on, and the angel of death would pass over. So the Egyptians weren't terribly excited about that idea. So it was really putting the Israeli people on the spot when the Lord said to do that. It was sort of, oh, well, hang on a minute, have we got the courage to do it? Because they could have been in danger of, what are you doing to our deity? It says here in Leviticus chapter 1 and verse 2, speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them, if any man of you bring forth an offering unto the Lord, ye shall bring your offering of the cattle, even of the herd or the flock. If his offering be burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own voluntary will. And that's really what the Lord was looking for. It wasn't a forceful thing. You bring it willingly from your sheep or your cattle or your goats to the Lord, and there was birds and things involved as well. But the idea, as I've said there in red, he shall offer it voluntarily. This is always an interesting one. I read this and I thought I've got to put this in. It talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 about the love and looking and caring for one another, and it says, no good shepherd would raise a rod or hit on a sheep or become jealous that a sheep is neater and healthier, that it would be abnormal. Instead, a shepherd shows his flock with love. He is patient, kind, forgiving, and tolerant of them. Sometimes you get a bit cranky with your sheep. But I'm not sure raising a rod would do much good, but the person that sort of brought this up was thinking of the scriptures in 1 Corinthians 13 and relating them to what a shepherd could do. Particularly there it says, talking about protecting his flock from wild animals, trying to feed off their food supply. We see there right at the bottom that shepherds are often seen as the symbols of peace and tranquility because they spend so much time with their flocks. They're out just doing whatever, sitting around and sort of leading here, leading there. And it talks in Bible times that shepherd consistently used both a rod and a staff to tend the flock. Both were used to protect the sheep in a very specific way. The rod was used to fight off wild animals and to count the sheep and direct them. The rod prodded during the day in the fields, at night into the sheepfold. A willing shepherd would respond to the prodding, but a stubborn, strong-willed sheep would not. So the rod really was for sort of getting rid of a wolf or something like that. You could actually hit him with it. Whereas the staff was to sort of guide it. You could actually put the crook on the staff around the sheep and pull it back, point it in a different direction. If they were caught in a thicket or something like that, you could get them out. Sheep find it very difficult for some reason to back out of something. They can, but they don't. In their stubborn way, they get stuck somewhere and they'll stay there. And if you try and get them out, they'll fight you. If you try and pull them and then let go, they'll go further into a bush or something. They become quite stubborn. So the idea of the staff was to, in effect, direct them where they should go. It talks here of Jesus' rod and staff. So what is the rod and staff that our good and great chief shepherd uses? What he's saying here, what's the staff and the rod that Jesus would use? And he suggests that figuratively it's his word, the word of God, the Bible, the Holy Scriptures. They move us, they direct us, they guide us, they correct us, they put us back on the right path, they keep us in the sheepfold under the care of our shepherd. So that's the idea. So the rod is to belt away the enemy, if you like, and the staff is used for directing us. And the suggestion is that Jesus is the great shepherd, looking after his sheep, Bible trivia, who was the first shepherd? It was always Abel, but there was plenty of others. Abraham, Lot, Isaac, Jacob, Rachel, Laban, Jacob's 12 sons, including Joseph, Moses, David, Mesha, who was the king of the Moab, and Jordan, Doeg, Amos, the shepherds who came to honour Jesus. It was a common thing for people to be shepherds. This is just a few sheep and him wandering along, he's showing them where to go. During the time of the patriarchs like Abraham and so on, those men, shepherding was a noble occupation. Shepherds are mentioned early in Genesis 4, where Jabal is called the father of those living in tents and raising livestock. In nomadic societies, everyone, whether sheik or slave, was a shepherd. The wealthy sons of Isaac and Jacob tended flocks. Jethro, the priest of Midian, employed his daughters as shepherdesses. So it was a common thing in Bible days for people to have a job, if you like, as a shepherd. And it was a noble job. It was a noble occupation that they were doing. When the 12 tribes of Israel migrated to Egypt, they encountered a lifestyle foreign to them. The Egyptians were agriculturalists. They actually dug the soil. If you read Isaiah 19, talks about the prophecy of the drying up of the Nile and so on, and their sluice gates. They used to use sluice gates to let water in and out from the Nile River in to flood their areas where they were growing whatever they were growing, cabbages or something, and then they could put the sluice gates down again. That was the idea of it. So all of a sudden, when the children of Israel turned up, they were shepherds. And it was quite foreign, except Arabs were shepherds as well, but they used to always fight with the Egyptians. I think they still do. It was a bit of a foreign thing. The shepherds meant their sheep and goats would eat the Egyptians' food. So it took a little while to sort things out in that area, which was interesting. In the days of the prophets, sheep herders symbolised judgment, social desolation. Zephaniah, he was a prophet. He talked about the area along the coast. It became the dwellings and the cottages along there were for shepherds. That's why it was sort of put judgment on Israel and so on as well, but also they were there. It was a desolate sort of an area. Amos, he was a shepherd, but he was called to be a prophet. And we read Dr. Joachim Jeremiah says shepherds were despised in everyday life. In general, they were considered second class and untrustworthy. All of a sudden, things started to change in their thought as to shepherds. We read in Amos chapter 7, he prophesied against the land of Judah and so on. Verse 14 there says, Amos said unto Amaziah, I was no prophet, neither was I a prophet's son, but I was a herdman and a gatherer of sycamore fruit. And the Lord took me as I followed the flock, and the Lord said unto me, Go, prophesy unto my people Israel. So Amos was originally just out minding his own business as a shepherd, and the Lord said, No, I want you to go and prophesy against my children Israel. So here and there we see through the scriptures of various people that were shepherds. Shepherding had not just lost its wide set appeal. This is this Dr. Jeremiah talking. It eventually forfeited its social acceptability. Some shepherds earned their poor reputation, but others became victims of a cruel stereotype. The religious leaders maligned the shepherd's good name. Rabbis banned pasturing sheep and goats in Israel, except out in the desert plains. You go away over there where no one else is. The Mishnah, Judaism's written recording of the oral law, also reflects that this prejudice, referring to the shepherds in belittling terms, one passage described them as incompetent, others say that no one should ever feel obligated to rescue a shepherd who has fallen into the pit. So they weren't highly thought of, obviously. This is by the leaders of Israel. They also talked about the shepherds were deprived of all civil rights. They could not fulfil judicial office or be admitted into courts as witnesses. He wrote to buy wool, milk or kid from a shepherd was forbidden on the assumption that it would have been stolen property. In Jerusalem in the times of Jesus, Jeremiah notes, the rabbis asked with amazement how, in view of the despicable nature of shepherds, one can explain why God was called my shepherd. In Psalm 23, that's what we're referring to. The Lord is my shepherd. When they looked at, hang on a minute, the shepherds are despised and so on, how could the Lord do that? We know this one quite well. I shall not want, he makes me lie down in green pasture, he leadeth me beside the still waters. And really, he's talking here about what a shepherd does. He restores the soul. He leads me into the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art there with me. Thy rod and thy staff comfort me. The Lord will protect us and look after us and guide us and lead us. And that's really what he was saying here. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The leaders back in those days were struggled with this particular chapter. Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, because shepherds were despised. It was an affront to the religious leaders who were so conspicuously absent from the divine mailing list. The Lord didn't send them anything. They didn't get any messages from God, that's what he's saying. Even from birth, Christ moved among the lowly. It was the sinners, not the self-righteous, he came to save. The proud religious of Christ's day have faded into obscurity, but the shepherd figure is once again elevated in church life as pastors shepherd their flock. That figure was immortalised by the Lord Jesus when he said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. Christ is also the great shepherd and the chief shepherd in those verses there. No other illustration so vividly portrays his tender care and guiding hand. And we see from these things, and when we recognise what a shepherd generally does, we can understand what Jesus is trying to do with our life. Sometimes we get a bit cranky, sometimes we go off the wrong tangents, sometimes we come up with our own ideas of religious paraphernalia or whatever. But if we listen to what Jesus said, if we read his word, we will be guided by it. My staff and my rod, to keep away the wrong ways and to direct us in the ways that we should go, as a shepherd would do that. And John chapter 10, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for his sheep. But he that is an hireling and not a shepherd, whose own the sheep are not, seeth the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees them, and the wolf catches them and scatters the sheep. The hireling fleeth because he is an hireling and careth not for his sheep. I am the good shepherd and know my sheep and am known of mine. As the Father knoweth me, even so I know the Father and lay down my life for the sheep. So Jesus was saying the hireling leaves the sheep when he sees the wolf and takes off and leaves them. Just changing the subject, many years ago in my work we had a situation where we came up with an idea that up at the Pusey Vale National Park, which is a national park just above Anguston there, the idea was they had goats up there, not sheep, had goats in the national park, which they weren't keen to have there. And they sort of come up with a scenario that there was an exotic disease in that area, so they had to get rid of the goats before they could get out of that area. So they used a thing like what they call a Judas goat, and they had a collar around one of the goats, particularly males, with a little radio on it, radio transmitter, and we would sit up in our tent 24 hours a day in shifts, and we would track where the goats were going, and the police would come in and they would shoot a particular lot and would keep the Judas goat because Goats are social animals. Even though you would scatter them, they will eventually come back together. And then you go on and do the same again. We did that for a fortnight, and we cleaned up all the goats in the Pewsey Vale National Park just to prove it could be done. And they were wild goats, they were destroying things. But when the wolf, or dare I say the police, turned up and they shot a few goats, the others would scatter. And it's a bit like they say here, the hireling. They would scatter them. And the hireling, when they see the wolf, when they see trouble, not me. They don't look after. Where Jesus, he's the good shepherd, he looks after his sheep. And we can be very much encouraged by that. Our Lord Jesus Christ is happy to, and he did lay down his life for you and I. And he's right there with his sheep, in amongst them, wherever they are. Up on obviously on the side of a hill, there's some good pasture there for them, and he's looking after them. He's there with them with he's got a sort of a staff. But the other one is to beware of sheep in ravenous clothing. Matthew talks about beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. You know them by their fruits, and do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? And the answer is no, obviously. In Matthew 10, behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. But ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Remember the Lord Jesus Christ. We keep our eyes on him. He's got the rod to keep the wolf away. If we get sidetracked, if we start looking somewhere else and so on, false prophets, different things, the enemy will come in. And the Lord's saying, I will protect you. He's got the rod. He's got the staff to guide us. But he said, I'll send you into a place as sheep into the midst of wolves. But he said, therefore, be wise in what you're doing. Be careful and be harmless, because they're watching you. Just a couple of photos of a couple of dogs and chasing some sheep along. That was the sort of thing I was talking about a little bit earlier, the northern area. I'm not sure exactly where this is. It could be anywhere in the northern central area of Australia, where they have more so cattle these days, but certainly many years ago they would run sheep through that area. It's beautiful country and has very good sheep. Saltbush mutton, you cannot better it. This one was caught a couple of years ago, I think it was around Canberra or something. I couldn't find out much about him. This sheep here on the left, and his wool, I think it was either 5 or 7 years without being shorn. They eventually shore it, and that was on the right. But this is the sort of thing, if they're not cared for, if they're not looked after, I mean, you're probably very fortunate, that sheep, but quite often when they get like that, and it rains, they get very wet and very heavy, and if they happen to stumble and fall, quite often they can't get up because it's too heavy, and so they die. So sheep, as we do, need to be cared for, need to be looked after. That's just a little example of what can happen if they were sort of left, and obviously a sheep was hiding somewhere and wasn't found for many years, but it wasn't cared for, and the end result could be death. And in the book of Luke, we see what man of you having 100 sheep, if he loses one, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after them which is lost until he find it. And when he found it, he layeth on his shoulder rejoicing, and when he cometh home, he calleth together his friends and neighbours, saying unto them, rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. And really, that's you and I. The Lord went out of his way. It always reminds me of my mother. I was a young bloke. I was only probably 5 or 10 years old. I wasn't very terribly big, but my father was always a bit crook, and so Mum did a lot of the work. And I remember her, she used to ride horses, as we all did. She would somehow, I'm not sure really how she worked it out, full-grown sheep she would put up on the shoulder of the horse, and then she'd get up on the horse herself and bring the sheep up to the shed, and maybe it was fly blown or something like that, the sheep, and we'd clean it up. And then she'd take it back. I don't know how she did it, but she was caring for the sheep. And this scripture reminded me of that. It was quite an effort. She wasn't as big as I am, so, to lift a full sheep up onto a horse, it was quite a feat. But she saw it needed looking after, it needed caring for. And sometimes we're in trouble like that. We get ourselves in a real mess at times, and we think, how are we going to get out of this? And the Lord can lift us up onto his shoulders and carry us. And I can remember the first photo, if you remember that man with his sheep on his shoulder. And that's the shepherd will care for his sheep that way. They'll look after them, because obviously the bottom line is, if you look after your sheep, they put money in your pocket. But as the Lord was saying here, he's lost one of his sheep somewhere, he'll go and find it. He'll look here and he'll look there, and when he finds it, when he finds you or I, he'll bring us into a place like the Good Samaritan, bring us into the church, look after them, but the Jesus Christ will look after them as well. As you said there in John 10, you believe not because you are not my sheep, not of my sheep. As I said unto you, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. And that's the basis of what we should be doing. We hear his voice, and he knows us, and we follow him. And he gives us eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. My Father which gave them me is greater than all, and no man is able to pluck them out of my Father's hand, and I and my Father are one. So he's put us in a position where the Lord will look after us. And no one's going to take us, because he's got his rod, and he's going to beat them off, because you can't get at them as long as we follow. All the people said.